In this video, I'm going to show you the photo settings that I use for the Sony a5100 camera. So let's not waste any time, let's hop right in the menu. So let's go ahead and hop right into the menu, which is this button right here. And so all the settings we're going to be talking about right now are in the camera settings, this first menu right here. So let's go ahead and click on that. So all these settings that I'm going to be talking about are what I personally use, and I think they're a great starting point if you're a beginner and you're just getting started into photography with the a5100. But feel free to change these however you want and however works best for you, because again, these are what I use, and everyone's going to prefer something a little different. So mess around with these however you want to fit best for you. So first we got shoot mode. And I shoot in manual mode because I like to adjust everything exactly how I want it. And in different modes, some of the settings are automatic. And I don't really like that as much except for one mode, which is aperture priority. I use that sometimes because basically you set the aperture to what you want and it adjusts everything else to, expose the shot as best as it can. And I use that sometimes when I'm, in a rush and I don't have time to properly check all the settings and expose everything, because aperture is the main thing that I typically know what I want. And so if I can just set that how I want it, the camera does all the rest of the work for me. So I sometimes use aperture priority, but 90% of the time I'm in manual exposure. Next up, image size. This is blurred out because of this other setting we're going to talk about, but this will be blurred out if you use the settings that I use. Otherwise, I would set that to fine if that's available for you, but I'm going to skip that for now. Next up, aspect ratio. I always keep it at 3:2. That is the regular aspect ratio of the sensor. That is like kind of the main aspect ratio that this camera uses. 16:9 will crop a little bit, but it will make it into basically the same aspect ratio of what you're watching this video in right now, which is kind of longer. 3:2 is a little taller and more squarish. So I use 3:2 because it gives me room to crop it in post, and it just uses the full capabilities of the sensor. So next up, quality. I keep this at RAW, and if you don't know what RAW is, it basically is a type of image that saves all of the data from the sensor, so that if you do want to bring it into an editing software like Adobe Lightroom, you can change all the settings, the white balance, you can change the exposure, all that stuff really easily, and it just saves all the data. And that is what I shoot in. They're pretty large files, so I want to warn you about that right off the bat. RAW files are quite large, but there's so much room and flexibility to edit them in post that's the reason why I shoot in RAW. Now, if you don't want to shoot in RAW, if you don't want to edit your photos, in an editing software, you just want them good out of the camera, I'd go right over to Fine, and that shoots in JPEG, which is a smaller file size, but it looks great straight out of the camera. And that unlocks this right here. So if you do want to shoot in Fine, which is a JPEG, then you're going to want to come up here and set it to L, which means large, 24 megapixels. So that'll use the full capability of the sensor, 24 megapixels of the sensor. These two are going to be smaller file sizes and smaller photos, which most of the time you're not going to want to use unless you really don't, if you have like a 1 gigabyte SD card, you might want to bring it down so you can fit more images onto an SD card. But nowadays, you want to shoot in L, 24 megapixel. If you're going to shoot in JPEG, fine. Panoramas, don't worry about those, and you can't do that in manual exposure as it is, so I just skip over those. On to page 2. So this has to do with video settings, which if you want to see a video about video settings, I will be releasing one. It might already be out if you're watching this, so go check out my channel or subscribe if it's not out, and stay tuned for it. But I will be making a separate video about the settings that I use for recording videos with the a5100, so stay tuned for that. But right here, drive mode and flash mode, these two have to do with photos. And drive mode, I keep this as single shooting most of the time, and that basically means when you press the shutter button, it'll take one photo. Even if you hold the shutter button down, it'll take a photo and stop. That's what that is a single shot picture shooting mode. And then there's all these other ones that you can look at and use if you like. I use single shooting most of the time because I take a picture and then I change my settings or do whatever I want to do to take another picture. But sometimes I'll use continuous shooting high, which basically means if you hold the shutter button down, it'll just take a picture after picture after picture after picture until you let go of the shutter button. And so that's pretty self-explanatory. If you need something like that, then you can use that. 90% of the time, I'm using single shooting mode. Flash mode, I personally don't use the flash on this camera. I think on-camera flashes just don't look very good. So I just keep that at what it was set at normally, which is fill flash. I don't use the flash at all, and I think there's way better options than using the on-camera flash. So I personally wouldn't even recommend using the on-camera flash at all. So that's it for page 2. Let's head on to page 3. Flash compensation, again, I don't use a flash, so I don't really worry about this. I just keep it at the 0 setting. Red eye reduction, I keep that off because in an editing software, I can do red eye reduction if I need to, and I just feel like I wouldn't ever need this feature enough to turn it on as it is, so I just keep that off. Focus mode, so I have a manual lens on here right now. Typically, what I would do is set this to continuous autofocus, and if you have the stock kit lens, which that's what this is right here, you're gonna wanna put it at continuous autofocus because what that does is always looking to track your subject and keep your subject in focus. And so that's what I use when I do have an autofocus lens on, and that's what I would recommend doing. And again, you can mess around with the different focus settings, but I use continuous autofocus 100% of the time that I do use autofocus. But when I do have a manual lens, which is what I have on right now, like a vintage lens or a cinema lens, it's obviously manual focus. Focus area, so this has to do with, autofocus. I keep this at wide because wide looks over almost the entire screen to look for something to focus on, which is usually the closest subject. I keep that on wide because, it's just a good all-around setting for autofocus. Now there are different settings for basically narrowing down on the spot that you want it to focus on, which can be useful for a lot of situations. And it's something else that you can, mess around with at your own pace. But I use wide because it's a nice, versatile, simple option. Autofocus Illuminator, I keep that off all the time. It's that really annoying red light on the front of the camera. It just makes things annoying, so I keep that off. Page 4. So these right here have to do with autofocus, and like I said, I have a manual lens on, so they're grayed out, so I can't really go into them, but I keep these right at the settings that it shows right here. I keep them both at normal because I find that that's a nice average speed. It doesn't look too snappy and choppy. It's a good middle ground. It focuses great, and I have no problems with normal. Exposure compensation, that's blurred out because I do use manual settings. But if you are in an automatic mode, you can change this to basically set it so if it goes above 0, like 0.3 or 0.7 or 1, it'll automatically make things brighter by however many stops it's set at. So that can be good if you're on an automatic mode and it looks kind of dark. You can move this up and it will just brighten things up and keep things always brightened a little more. And same goes the other way. You can set the number negative and it'll make things look a little darker, only on automatic settings. Since I'm in manual, it is grayed out and I don't use that. ISO, this is something that you typically just use as low as ISO as possible, but I find this camera's good up until around, anything after 800 is typically where you start to see noise. So anything under 800 I use, but again, I try to keep this as low as I can to best fit the settings. All right, on to page 5. Metering mode, I use multi, and this is basically like the focus mode, the wide focus mode, because multi looks over the entire screen to find an exposure. And now this doesn't really do anything in manual mode because this is to help find exposure when you're in automatic mode. But if you are in automatic mode, just use multi. It's just the best all-around option. White balance, I keep this at auto 100% of the time. And white balance is basically controls how warm and cool your image looks, and automatic does a great job. Honestly, I wouldn't even worry about it. And if you shoot in RAW, you can change your white balance in your editing software. Now DRO, which is Dynamic Range Optimizer / Auto HDR, I keep this at auto. I find it does a good job of optimizing the dynamic range, which is essentially exposing for highlights and the shadows all at once to kind of smooth things out. I just set that at auto and I find that does a pretty great job in this camera. Then creative style. This is almost like a filter on Instagram, so you can change this to black and white, sepia, vivid. I keep this as standard because, again, this doesn't actually change anything when you shoot in RAW, and you can control all this in your editing software in RAW. But if you're shooting JPEG, you can obviously mess around with this however you want to really change the picture how it suits you best. Picture effect, that's blurred out because you can't really change that when you're shooting RAW, and that's kind of the same thing as like a filter over the image, but I don't mess with that because I shoot in RAW. All right, on to page 6, focus magnifier. I don't use that because 90% of the time I shoot in autofocus like I said, but basically what this does is when you are manual focusing, it can zoom in on the image to help focus, but I find that I don't ever need that, and it's not a super handy feature for me. High ISO noise reduction. This is disabled because I'm shooting in RAW. If you are shooting in JPEG, I would still keep this off unless you find that you're getting a lot of noise if you have to use high ISOs. And so if you're shooting a lot in dark scenes, you could turn this on and it just basically gets rid of some of the noise, but I shoot in RAW and I can just do this in my editing software. I can, add noise reduction, so I don't mess with this. Center lock on autofocus. If you are using autofocus, what this does is basically locks the autofocus on the center of the screen, which could be handy for some people. I keep that off because I don't find that it's useful for me at all. Smile face detection, I keep that on because if I'm taking a picture of a person, obviously, and their face is in the scene, it'll automatically focus on their face, which is almost all the time what you're gonna wanna focus on if you're taking a picture of someone. So that's a really handy feature in this camera. Page 7. So all this stuff, soft skin, auto object framing, just stuff I keep right at these settings on off basically, because this stuff really isn't useful for me. Soft skin, it kind of makes your skin look softer, it softens the image. That could be useful for you. I find that it doesn't look that good. And all the stuff I keep off, except steady shot. Now this is darkened out because I don't have a lens with steady shot enabled, but if you are using something like the kit lens with this camera or any other lenses that this option isn't grayed out with, always keep this on. It basically stabilizes the footage or the photos and just helps you get sharper photos, especially if you shoot in lower light settings where you have to use a longer shutter speed. So just 100% of the time, just keep that on if you have the option. Next up, color space, just keep it at sRGB. That's just the best option. On to page 8, auto slow shutter, and this is for movies. This has nothing to do with photos. I'm gonna bring this up when I talk about the video settings, so go check that out or subscribe if it's not uploaded yet. And then audio recording, with noise reduction, these are both with movies as well. And that actually wraps it up for this page. And this is the main photo settings page. This is the stuff that really focuses on the quality of your photos. And so all these other menus are more personal settings that you can change to best fit your shooting. But again, they don't have to do with image quality itself. So there we go, that wraps it up for the photo settings that I use with my Sony a5100. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, feel free to go down, hit the like button, and subscribe to my channel. And also, if you want to support me, I do have Amazon affiliate links to all my gear and some other gear in the description, so feel free to check out those links. And if you do order anything through my links, I will get a small kickback at no extra cost to you. So that would really help me out. And I also have an Artlist affiliate link if you're interested in signing up for Artlist. And I even advise you just to check it out and just see if it's something that you'd be interested in. It's a music licensing platform with thousands of songs and sound effects. So go check out Artlist and see if it's something that you would be interested in. And if you are interested, you can use my link to sign up for it and get 2 free months. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.